Hello, I'm Professor Eric Martin, and you must be in History 102. In this short video segment, I want to introduce Chapter 4 in Worlds of History, looking at empire and government, China and Rome from 300 BC to 300 CE. And really what we're doing in this particular chapter is we are delving into comparative history just a little bit more. In our previous chapters, we were introduced to the idea of secondary and primary sources. In chapter 3, we used the secondary and primary sources to do a comparison of Greek and Indian ancient societies and how they organized themselves socially based off that thesis presented by McNeill. This week, it's a very similar exercise, but with no thesis. We got two secondary sources, and then we got a number of primary sources from ancient China, a number of primary sources from ancient Rome. Now, one of the things that I'd like for you to think about is when we set up a historical comparison, it might be useful for us to, think of it a little bit like setting up a chemistry experiment or something. We're not used to thinking about the social sciences as evaluating data, having constants, having variables, having a thesis. But I think that might be very useful for you, especially in terms of making sure that you're able to set up some kind of a comparison that is comparing apples to apples, for lack of a better way to put it. Now, the first part of the chapter is simply maps, and I think it's useful to just keep in mind that the Han Chinese and the Roman Empire are the two separate ends of the Silk Roads during this period. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind as we go. And I am not going to cover each and everything in the chapter. I'm just going to try to provide you a little bit of context that maybe helps our discussion boards this week to to go a little smoother. The Michael Low piece, looking at the government of the Qin and the Han Chinese empires. Keep in mind, what are his categories that he uses for analysis? He specifically looks at the structure of government, and he focuses in on the issue of civil service. That is different than what happens in Rome. Rome, as you will see from the Purcell document a little bit later on, is much more committed to what we describe as a feudal system. The Chinese, in a lot of ways, have gotten rid of that. So keep that element in mind. That very first document by Low also talks about the armed forces and the differences that you see in terms of when we think about the Roman army and the professional army and sort of the role of heroic soldiers. Low makes the argument that we don't see that in ancient China, that you still have a big army, but you don't have a military tradition in the sense of professional soldiers. You have some volunteers, but you also have a number of convicts who were on some kind of a short-term release, but then it is a general conscription. Every male between the ages, I think it is, of 23 and 56, is expected to spend 2 years in the army, and there's not the kind of a focus that you see. Also, in the Low piece, he talks about the officials. What kind of officials do we see in China, and how does that correlate to the kind of officials we might see in Rome in the Purcell document? How do the officials get their positions, for example? What are they expected to do? Even simple things like the Chinese officials, right? Once they get their job, they're sent away. They're sent to a place where they don't know anybody. So they're not allowed to collect taxes in their home region, for example. And then in the Low piece, and we've kind of jumped back and forth between the Low and the Purcell piece, but the Low piece, he looks at some of the weaknesses and problems that we see through the Chinese system of administration, and really the main weakness or the issue he points out, right, is that in ancient China, there is no tradition of a public forum. The public debates over policy. In China, those debates or discussions occur face to face behind closed doors. And that is a different kind of tradition which produces some different kinds of documents. I want to skip to the Purcell document for just a minute and make sure that I've kind of covered what I wanted to deal with as far as that goes. In the Purcell document, he really focuses on the Roman end of things. And he says it's very easy to misinterpret Roman history based on one district. And he emphasizes that the Roman Empire is a number of different governorships. They are run differently with some similarities, but he really de-emphasizes the idea that there is some Roman omnipotence that sends out directives to all the districts, and they're ruled uniformly. He speaks quite a bit of Roman indirect rule. He also goes into the role of law and legal practice in the Roman districts, and that's something that's different than in China. So I want you to pay attention to that. The search for bureaucracy. He points out that the bureaucracy in Rome doesn't really exist, and certainly not the way we see it in China. So when you want to see some kind of a difference in terms of the basic structure, the bureaucracy is one spot that you would look for. And then he goes into issues of communication and information. So those two secondary sources just gives us some things to look at. Now, in terms of the primary sources, and I just want to briefly point out things to look for in the primary sources. And I would like for y'all to bring more discussion into the primary sources. I know that's difficult, but you need to bring this out. This is where the historians read between the lines to try to figure out what went on in the past. The Sima Qian, the biography of the harsh officials. That's interesting for two reasons. One, it's interesting because of the accounts he provides. Two, it is a document created by one of the high-level officials of the Han Empire. So this gives you a look into the world of one of the officials that Purcell was talking about, both in terms of who he's writing on, who Lowe was talking about, based on the narrative that he's telling, but also based on himself. So you can get some ideas about what's happening in terms of Chinese history. Pay attention to the mentions of Confucius and Lao Tzu at the very beginning. Here we come to Confucius. That's the next piece. Wow, it's hard to imagine a more important philosophical personality than Confucius. And his Analects provide a real look into how Chinese administration and the Chinese worldview would center for the next couple of thousand years. Confucius is living during a time of turmoil and war, and his solution to the instability was based on a concept of human love, and one in which social hierarchy is put back together in a rather sophisticated way, in the sense that I am both a parent and I am a child. When I'm in my parent role, I'm supposed to act one way. When I'm in my child role, I'm supposed to act another way. Basically, the world around us operates like this. We need to know what our social positions are. He also believes that human nature is good, and that if people are allowed to more or less go about their business, they'll make the right choices. This makes him very different than Han Fei and the legalist piece that we take a look at. The legalists and the Confucianists are directly opposed to one another on this issue of, is human nature good or is it evil? The legalists believe that it is evil. If humans are left to their own devices, they will be up to shenanigans. Therefore, laws should be strict. Laws should be uniform. There should be no deviation from the law. And the idea that we look back at history, or that we use something called virtue, or that we make judgments one by the one, Han Fei and the legalists aren't necessarily into in terms of a way of providing additional social order. The Salt and Iron Debates. That document is in here not so much because the debates, although the debates are interesting, but because it even happened. Again, in Han China, the idea that you would have a public forum to debate policy, that was not part of the society. In this particular case, the emperor calls for a debate, basically between the Confucius and the legalists, over this issue of what to do with the salt and iron monopolies. The Roman documents that you have, fairly simple. Cicero's piece, the letter to his brother, really explaining how to rule. I think you can find ways to compare that to some of the Chinese documents. Again, do you think Cicero believes human nature is basically good or evil? This correspondence that we have between Pliny and Trajan over what to do with the Christian rabble-rousers is pretty interesting. Go through that. Get a sense. How concerned do they really seem to be about Christian activity? What's at stake, and what's the advice given? And then finally, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. Take a look at his meditations. Read them carefully. This is, and what do they sound like? Again, this issue of, does he seem to think human nature is mostly good, mostly evil? How do you put that into a package of statecraft? And then after you've gone through all these, your mission is to lay out some comparisons between ancient China and ancient Rome in terms of statecraft, in terms of the creation of empires, but also in terms of the ideas behind those empires, behind the creation of those states. What are their approaches to government? I know this has been a rather quick video, but I want it to be quick. I want the discussion to take place in the discussion boards, but maybe this helps set things up a little bit. As usual, if you have any questions about the class, don't hesitate to contact me. Call me on the phone, send me an email, drop by the office, and enjoy your study of history.